So I'll start by just addressing the panel abstract so that there's some context around what we're discussing this morning. This panel actually celebrates community by redefining Blackness and its cultural significance to society at large. It's portrayed in literature, music, and language, as we all know, and each presentation seeks to empower and inform across cultural communities by extending research papers that originated in Afrocentricity and womanism. My presentation is titled Monsters, Music, and the Movement, across comparative cultural and rhetorical analysis of Kanye West and Lady Gaga's Monster. The background and context behind this particular research investigation really stems from the fact that these are platinum selling music artists, and as a result of their success as music artists, they have song lyrics that have message meaning, of which affects how people begin to think about who they are, how they are. It affects pop culture and the ideologies and social discourse that sort of are derived from that pop culture as lived experience, or at least the articulated experience and storytelling abilities of these artists. The study investigates how West and Gaga begin to use the term monster in their respective songs in both a cultural and rhetorical context. I wanted to just make sure that I situated our discussion in a review of literature that currently exists to sort of frame what it is that we're talking about here. And in one instance, Ramsey, in his work, he addresses that all Black music making is driven by and permeated with the memory of things from a cultural past, and that recognition of the viability of such a memory should play a role in the perceptions and criticisms of works and performances of Black music. That statement is actually centered in Afrocentricity. Afrocentricity, in accordance to its theoretical and philosophical framework established by Molefi Asante, begins to articulate a connection between the past and the present in this lineage that exists between Africanity and the African American experience as sort of this African diasporic perspective and worldview that helps situate Black people in a sense of agency outside of any other cultural influence. In other work, the research begins to suggest that Africans have adapted their beliefs to specific circumstances, especially as their status as enslaved people has caused a need for the utilization of traditions towards an end for personal and collective empowerment. The effort of slaves to preserve a sense of culture in the midst of circumstances that actually try to challenge and in some instances eradicate a sense of self, culture, self-esteem, and all of the elements that are oftentimes associated with that. But in being able to just sustain one's own sense of agency and culture, you begin to establish a ritual and lived experience of resistance and self-liberation. So shifting from the cultural context of this conversation and really getting into the heart just very quickly about what it means to talk about monsters in a scholarly context. In 2010, research suggests that of monsters, it's referred to a characterization where one makes himself a vulnerable human, not a monster necessarily. And that in other instances, and the other, of course, speaks to the power sources, the influences, the authority that different regimes may have. And so oftentimes we're talking about sort of white hegemony in this context, but it makes the monster a stock figure of danger and a pure other. And as research has suggested and provided us over several years, oftentimes Blacks are perceived as the other. People of color are oftentimes the other in comparison to the more predominant or assumed to be universal cultural ideology of Eurocentrism. Gerard Jones explains that every body of sacred lore is woven of conflicts and murders and bloody devourings, and that even pacifist traditions are transmitted through metaphors of violence, where Jesus brought not only peace but the sword, and if you meet Buddha on the road, you're encouraged to kill him. And it's these types of myths, these types of stories and histories of monstrosities, these others that challenge the status quo, that try to establish some sense of their own agency, even outside of a cultural context, that these myths begin to sort of surface, and these descriptions of people as monstrosities starts to come into place. Blacks as savages and brutes and so on and so forth, from just an ethnographic observation of previous research that, of course had a certain level of bias, began to create depictions of, these foreign people as the other, and that other always transitioned into something that was a monstrosity of sorts, because it was oftentimes not understood. Before I actually transition into Kanye West monster, it's also worth noting that in very recent research, monsters have started to evolve in an ideological conceptualization, in that they've transitioned from being, King Kong, Godzilla, the thing that you oftentimes see on, big movie screens, or now have such a historic place in pop culture, and they now have become the very element of things that are in fact human, but are characterized in more of a moral regard. And so you have, the pedophile as a monster, and people that begin to kind of break the moral codes of society in a human context, captured as a monster. And so the way that we begin to discuss these ideologies and archetypes of what a monster is has now begun to shift as a result of some leveling with regard to just people being able to recognize each other's humanness, establishing a global community so people don't feel that others are as foreign. But there still is a method by which society has a process for establishing what the other is, especially when it breaks from tradition and moral regard. So my method for this research investigation actually uses a rhetorical analysis, and it focuses, of course, on an interpretive qualitative method. The cultural analysis uses Afrocentricity and Eurocentricity to further examine the lyrical rhetoric of Kanye West and Lady Gaga. In the rhetorical analysis, the understanding of the message meaning and the overall context of both West and Gaga's lyrics really is a byproduct of the whole rhetorical analysis process. By framing both artists' lyrics in a cultural context and general meaning, the specifics of their lyrics undergo a greater scrutiny, and so oftentimes you have people who are not necessarily rhetoricians or researchers listen to music, and you sort of just accept it at face value, and you don't really analyze it for a more critical understanding. And so the purpose of being a communicologist and undergoing this type of research investigation is certainly to establish some context and meaning behind the lyrics that can sometimes appear to be sort of empty in their approach, and sort of just for the purpose of only entertaining, but certainly sometimes has more warranted context behind the actual message itself. In cultural analysis, the short and sweet of it is that it really provides both artists an opportunity to have their lyrical rhetoric situated in the context of their particular cultural center. And when I say their particular cultural center, I can't begin to make assumptions about the maybe static cultural center that Kanye West or Lady Gaga begin to take. I wouldn't take liberties in that way, but what their lyrical rhetoric does is inform you of the center of analysis, the cultural center of analysis that they had when they were writing their lyrics. Now, whether that's intentional or not intentional is still in question, but what does exist is a context where a cultural analysis using either Afrocentric method or Eurocentric method informs people of what can be inferred or sort of interpreted based upon the textual content that's available. And so on that basis, we examine the text as evidence of the cultural center.